If you just, go march in there and, have no people skills and just demand, I want this, I want that, you're not going to get anywhere.
So the justice is not swift.
It's not swift or cheap. I feel like we've been offering a lot of advice.
Free advice.
A lot of free legal advice. I mean, I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and still when I hear professor or excuse me, professor, or anytime that, term comes up, I'm like, wait, is there somebody behind me, or where's the professor? Who are we talking to?
It's a skill course. And I didn't see it as a skill course. I saw it as a obstacle on my way to becoming a great attorney. Right?
Yeah.
Law school doesn't teach you everything. Hey everyone, welcome back. I am Greg Czubernat, a personal injury attorney and your host. Today, I am joined by my friend from law school, Dario Dzananovic, an Illinois appellate court law clerk who also teaches legal research and writing. We're going behind the scenes of the legal world to share with you some insider tips we wish we had known. Whether you're in law school, preparing for the bar exam, or just curious about the law, you will find practical advice and candid stories. Let's get started. So, Dario, do you remember how we first met? I think this was during the orientation, the first day of law school. Do you remember anything about it?
Well, the beginning of law school was kind of a blur. I remember orientation was at the top floor of, I think, the library that's close to DePaul. And we might have met there, but really my first memory of you was from our legal writing course. And that's kind of a funny experience in itself because you're put into a smaller room with people who you're going to learn to write with, so they're your colleagues. But at the same time, they're people you're going to be potentially against in the courtroom and also competing for that A for. So it's a very interesting process meeting people in a course like that where they're simultaneously your friends and your enemies. So you got to always keep one eye open. But yes, I remember you and another one of our friends to this day in legal writing commiserating quite a bit over those first few assignments where we were just not getting the hang of it. But, with some practice, we got better. So I think my first solid memory of you was from our legal writing course first semester.
What's one of your favorite memories from our time as law students?
Favorite. Well, I would say that one of the most memorable times, perhaps not favorite, was when we were both studying for the bar exam. And I remember spending the entire days in the library, and I think you did the same. And I would call you, you would call me to complain, to freak out about the questions that we were answering, about the essays that we were writing. But it was really nice to have somebody, kind of there with you going through the same thing and being able to offer some good advice. So I distinctly remember those days in the library where I felt like our summers were taken away from us, but it was still nice to be able to speak with somebody going, through the same horrible time. But luckily, neither of us had to take the bar exam a second time, so I guess we did something right.
You're right. I remember that. I actually did most of my bar preparation study at a local Starbucks. And it feels like it was just yesterday. I still think of myself as a new attorney, even though I graduated now more than 10 years ago.
In our field, you're always learning something. You can never become the master of the law. Even if you specialize in something, you will always learn something new. And I do a lot of writing in my work as an appellate court law clerk. And I think writing is another skill that you improve your entire life. You can never get to 100% amazing, perfect writing. There are things that you continue to learn, but I think that's also what makes the profession nice, is that you will never be bored. There's always a way to advance and get better. So I simultaneously feel like a new attorney, but sometimes I feel like I know what I'm doing. So it's kind of a mix of both worlds.
Let's dive into your experience working at the appellate court. But before we do, can you explain what a law clerk actually does?
So it depends if you're a law clerk for a law firm or if you're a law clerk for a judge. You can be all kinds of different law clerk. I personally work for one of the judges at the Illinois Appellate Court. And again, even within the judges, it varies from judge to judge what exactly their law clerk does. But I can speak for myself and say that I have a substantial hand in drafting decisions on a variety of criminal and civil cases. So anything that comes to the state trial level and gets appealed to the appellate court is fair game. So it's a variety of work. It's slightly more criminal than civil, but I would say that pretty much anything you can think of will come before us. Now, there are certain areas of the law that are only federal, so we're not going to hear those. For instance, immigration will not get immigration cases because that's strictly federal. And, if somebody brings a lawsuit against somebody under Section 1983 or another federal law, we're not going to get those because those will be at the federal court. But my day-to-day essentially is a lot of reading, a lot of researching, and a lot of writing.
So a repeat of law school, especially the legal writing and research class that we both took, and we sat right next to each other. And I think 3, right? Legal research and writing 1, 2, and 3. We did all 3 of them together.
Yes. So it was one of the most important classes in law school, and a lot of people hated it, which is unfortunate because that's mostly what we do as lawyers. But I would say that those are the most important skills for my job. I analyze a long record, sometimes thousands of pages. I look for the issues that are brought by the parties and see which side is making the better argument, apply the correct standard of review and come out to what I think is the correct decision. And as I said, I draft a substantial portion of these decisions myself, of course, with the supervision of the judge. But it's it can be a very solitary process because you work by yourself generally on a case until you end up discussing it with your judge. But what I find the best about the job is that, unlike law school, you're actually working with real cases that impact real people. These are real appellants. These are real parties who were aggrieved, and they're seeking some kind of recourse through the legal system. And sometimes cases are boring that you work on, but the nice part is once you finish that case, you go on to something completely different. You're not stuck on one area of the law as you might be in practice. In practice, you're usually an expert in something, and you end up doing that over and over and over again. Whereas here, okay, you don't like one case on contracts, well, maybe the next case will be family law, and it'll be more interesting for you.
And as a law clerk at the appellate level court, do you have any flexibility or any say as to which case you want to work on and which cases you can pass on to hopefully another clerk that the judge has available?
So typically at our court, each judge has 3 clerks. And every couple of weeks, we get new ready cases, which are appeals that have all the filings ready, and we can start working on them. Now, we can tell the judge, what our preference is, but ultimately it will be the judge who decides to whom which case to give. But a lot of the times, the judge will defer to the preferences of the clerks, and it also just depends on who's working on what at a given moment. So if only one case comes in and only one person is available, well, then that person will be working on a particular case.
Dario, if you can tell me, and I'm sure the audience is interested as well, because we all struggle with time management, right? Or work-life balance. So I'm really curious how you balance the insane amount of work that comes across your desk. I would like to know how you balance the legal research, the drafting, and just daily administrative tasks and whatever else the judge has for you at that day.
That's a very good question. And time management is something that all attorneys struggle with at one point in their careers, or just across the board. The good thing about working at the appellate court is that the volume of cases that we receive and have to review is smaller than the volume of cases that the trial court gets, because not every case gets appealed. But while we receive fewer cases, we actually get usually pretty large cases with a lot of volumes of record and a lot of things to consider. I personally like having fewer cases that are bigger as opposed to tons of smaller cases. You can devote more of your attention and analysis to the really important big picture cases. Now, your second question about how I divide my time between the research and the writing and how I try to keep my head above water. Well, luckily I have 2 co-clerks, and they are helpful in many different ways, including bouncing ideas off of each other, looking at things from a different perspective you might not have thought of. But also, one of our clerks has a partial duty to deal with administrative issues. So luckily, I basically just work on cases. So that gives me more time to focus on the meat and bones of what we do. But usually I review the briefs. I make sure that everything the parties say aligns with what actually happened. So I check the record against the parties' arguments, and then I start my research. Of course, that can take a lot of time. It can take a little bit of time. It depends on how many issues a party raises, right? It depends how complicated the issues are. It depends how much case law there is. So every case is unique, and the amount of time you spend on the different portions of what goes into writing a decision is different. So sometimes the bulk of your time will be spent researching. Other times the bulk will be spent writing. It just depends on the nature of the cases and the issues and how in-depth those certain portions are. So that's kind of how I try to balance it, is to give every part of the writing process what it's due for a particular case.
How often does it happen that you come to work, let's say on Monday morning, you have your day planned out and you thought you're going to do certain things, but then you got some fires to put out? Like I know in my personal injury practice, for example, I come to work on one day and I previous night time blocked everything accurately, so I know precisely which case I'm going to work on. And 2 hours into the day, I have plenty of unexpected emails, phone calls, things that are trying to pull me away and put out a fire that just started somewhere else. Does that happen to you?
Very rarely. And that's one of the things that I really enjoy about my job, is that a lot of the fires that happen when you work as a lawyer at a firm simply don't exist at the appellate court. Things are a lot calmer. And I think one of the reasons for that is because as a law clerk, you basically have one boss. It is the judge you work for. So you work for the courts, you work for the judge. And when you are practicing law, you have several different people that you have to keep happy at all times while balancing usually a large volume of cases. So you have to keep the judge in a particular case happy, meeting the judge's deadlines and the court's deadlines. You have to be responsive to your client, and some clients require more responses than others. You have to be responsive to whoever is overseeing your work. It could be a managing partner or a senior associate. And a lot of the times, these people are also under pressure. So by the time they give you an assignment at a firm, it has to be done yesterday. So because you have all these other people that you owe some kind of duty to and explanation to, you end up in a situation where you can't really plan your day. We don't have that, and I think the big reason is because we have just the court to answer to, and as long as you're working on your cases that you're assigned in a timely fashion, you shouldn't really have to worry about any fires. I would say maybe the one exception is if we get an expedited case and there are certain categories of cases that we have to decide quickly. And usually we have 6 months from the day we get a case. For some cases, it's more like do it as soon as possible. Those cases usually involve really sensitive issues like children's custody, custody of children, parental rights, things that you would expect should be resolved on a quick basis. But generally speaking, you don't have to worry too much about the fires.
So what you're trying to say, I have as many bosses as I have clients, while you're lucky enough to only have to answer to one boss.
That's a very good summary, yes.
Now, for anyone in our audience considering a career as a law clerk for a judge, what advice would you give them to help them understand the job and prepare for it?
Sure. So I think at the most fundamental level, pretty much anybody who's in law school who wants to be a lawyer can benefit from a clerkship. It doesn't matter whether you intend to be a litigator or whether you prefer to do transactional work, because the skills that are required for being successful at a clerkship are those that are required for being a good lawyer. So it's research and writing, analyzing and being persuasive. Now, to prepare for a clerkship, I think the best thing to do is do an externship. If your school allows you to work for credit for a judge during law school, I would absolutely take advantage of that opportunity. And indeed, I worked for 2 judges while I was in law school. which gave me the idea that I would like to do this in the long term because I really enjoyed it during that externship. And that way you understand whether you would like it before you actually get into it. I would really recommend working for a judge during law school where you can learn what goes into decisions and hone more into your writing skills. Now, if you don't like that, then don't do a clerkship afterwards, but at least you have that knowledge. And I would say also take more writing classes and more advocacy classes than those that are required, because again, these are some of the most important skills. So if you're thinking about doing a clerkship, try to find an externship with a judge during law school and take as many advocacy and writing classes as you possibly can, because there's never too much you can learn in that respect.
How did you come to teach legal research and writing at DePaul? Was this always on your radar?
So I wouldn't say it was always on my radar, but I think I need to provide a little bit of a backstory to answer that question fully. So before I started my work at the appellate court and started working with a judge, I was actually working on my Ph.D. in the Netherlands, and I worked on immigration law. I wrote a dissertation comparing the role of religious organizations in immigration law in the United States and in the Netherlands. So this was something that I was interested in, and part of that program included a little bit of teaching. So that was kind of my first foot in the door of teaching. And when I finished my PhD and I came back to the United States, I still had a little bit of an itch to further explore that avenue. And I figured what better topic to teach than immigration. I just spent nearly 5 years working on it. So I reached out to a former professor of mine from DePaul. You probably know her, Professor Livingston. And she put me in touch with the right people at DePaul that ended up landing me this part-time teaching role at DePaul to teach immigration law. And that was my first full semester of teaching. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I wanted to continue teaching. But it was a course that was offered only for one semester per year, and the following year it was filled. So I decided, okay, well, I asked them if they had any other courses that my skill set would match in terms of teaching, and they suggested Legal Writing 3 because that has an appellate component to it. And I said, why not? I mean, it's not immigration. It's less of a substantive, less of a doctrinal course, more of a skills course. But I was also a TA for my legal writing teacher in law school. So I got some experience in at least grading at that point. And I thought, okay, well, why not try this as well? It'll be different, but it'll still be teaching. It'll be somewhat related to my job at the appellate court, where I do a lot of writing and research. And so I taught the legal writing course at DePaul. That's kind of how I got into the whole teaching as on a part-time basis role. My main job is still with the court, but I teach some classes as an adjunct.
So now that you tried teaching immigration law and legal research and writing, which of the two you like better?
Well, I would say my preference is immigration law. One major reason is that there is a lot of grading in legal writing, so that takes up a lot of time. Whereas immigration is more focused on, teaching and one final exam. So you just have one portion of the semester where you're grading, whereas the focus of legal writing is a series of assignments to build your skills, and those need to be graded. And that just takes a lot of time, and you really need to devote substantial amounts of every day to be able to get that done. On top of that, I think that it's easier to teach something like immigration because it's a lot of substantive law. It's difficult to teach legal writing because it's a skill, and it's something that needs to be fine-tuned with practice. You can't just take one semester and suddenly be an amazing writer. As I mentioned earlier, we learn to become better writers our whole lives. It's not something that you just master in one semester. Whereas, a substantive course where you learn the black letter law is something that you can at least somewhat understand, to a decent degree after one semester. And I just enjoy the issues more because it's always a hot topic, right? Regardless of who the president is, immigration is always something that's a hot button issue. So it's always evolving. There's always something new to talk about, new perspectives to gain, and it's a very quickly living, developing area of the law. So that makes it interesting for me and for the students because, it's something that's never going to be going away, and there will always be some work in it. So it's just I find it more interesting to teach, and also from a content perspective.
What I remember from legal research and writing when we were law students, that class required definitely way more hand-holding from the professor than any other class, like substantive class, like you said. I still remember when I was stuck at the library, I wasn't quite sure how to move forward, and I would email the professor and try to schedule office hours to resolve my issues, my questions, address them right away so I can finish the assignment on time.
You're absolutely right. And, I had a similar experience in legal writing. It's one of those things where you really have to ask for help. And being on the other side of that equation now, as a teacher, it's difficult to strike the right balance between how much handholding and how much you want to give the students independence and discretion, because when they get out of law school, they're going to need to fend for themselves. They can't just show up to their supervising attorney and, tell them, oh, well, I didn't really know how to do this and I don't know what the answer is, so could you please help me? Nobody's going to look favorably upon that. So I want to make sure the students are getting the right guidance, but also giving them enough independence and the tools necessary to be able to get to the right answer and then to correctly write themselves.
That's a great point. And I think at least the associates, the newer attorneys that I came across, some of them hope they can fine-tune their skills on a job. But the sad reality is you're getting hired because there's job to do, not because somebody is trying to make you a better lawyer by sharing with you everything they know about legal writing.
That's exactly right, especially if you start in a busy firm, which I would suggest to anybody. That's how you learn. You have to, be exposed to a large volume of cases and a lot of workload. But the person who's supervising your work isn't going to have the time, to be, first of all, necessarily nice to you. You might get a paperback that you submitted with just a giant red X over it with redo written on it, right? So you have to also grow a tougher skin. But, you're not going to get the kind of feedback from your supervising attorney that you're going to get from your legal writing teacher. So you should really get the most out of those classes in law school because, as you correctly point out, it's difficult to get to build the expertise in writing when you get out of law school, because oftentimes, especially at the beginning, as the junior attorney, you'll be doing the things that nobody else wants to do, which might not be as legal or as closely related to what you thought you'd be doing in law school.
And guess what? Your boss that's assigning the work, I'm sure he's going to give you the stuff he doesn't want to do or give you the stuff nobody at the firm wants to do.
Yeah, and it's not all, gloomy. It's not all gloom and doom. You can climb the totem pole. You just have to show that you're able to do the more basic tasks before you're given something more complicated to do. So I would suggest starting out, you really got to apply yourself 110%, unless you want to get stuck doing the menial tasks for longer than you should.
So Dario, what is your teaching style and how do you make legal research and writing interesting for your students?
I am sort of old school when it comes to teaching styles. The viewers, your viewers may be familiar with the Socratic method, but for those who are not, the Socratic method is basically a way of teaching where you ask a question, and you call on a student, you ask a question, and you go back and forth. So the student answers, you ask a sub-question, you test the validity of their answer, you challenge part of it, playing some devil's advocate back and forth to really make sure that the student has thought about all angles of a problem, which is important, I think, in the practice of law, is to look at each issue from as many angles as possible. So I really employ the Socratic method in immigration when I teach that course, but I also try to employ it in legal writing. Now, not everybody is a fan of the legal writing Socratic method, and some students really hate legal writing. They view it as a class that they don't really need, which I obviously disagree with. But some students would prefer to just be spoon-fed information in legal writing and then be done with it. I personally don't think that's effective. As you and I both pointed out, it's one of these skills that you have to build, and it's something that you have to think about. You can't just tell somebody how to write. You have to show somebody, explain to somebody. And the best way to show and explain is indeed to employ the Socratic method. Let's get a debate going inside the classroom about writing, how to best formulate an argument, what the most important argument is and why. If we go back and forth and force everybody to think about it, they'll do two things. They'll better remember what we've learned, and they'll actually use their brain in a way that a lawyer should be using it, to think logically, to think persuasively, to arrive at the right answer. So while students may not necessarily be all huge fans of the Socratic method, I do believe it's an effective way, and I try to use it as much as I can.
I think you made a great point about how the legal research and writing is really different from other substantive law courses. So although it's packaged together with other law school classes like contracts, for example, it really isn't, because while contracts talks about substantive law, and this is sort of what the law student, especially the 1L, the first year law student, expects to. They went to law school to learn the law, and here you are trying to tell them how to write, which in a 1L mind may have nothing to do with being a lawyer.
Yes, and one of the things that you should do, I think, as when you first start teaching these very fresh students, is explain that a lot of them don't know this, but explain to them that being a lawyer in the real world is not what you see on Law and Order or what you see on TV. If you assume that you're going to go out and spend 100% of your time in court arguing some consequential, huge cases, then you need a reality check, because the vast majority of the work that a lawyer does will be behind a computer, behind a Westlaw terminal, and behind a Word document. In other words, at least 90% of your work will be done like that, whereas maybe 10%, depending on your practice, you'll actually spend in court. So that's why it's important to learn how to write. And I also like to stress the point that while you may have learned to write in undergrad or high school, this is a different kind of writing. This is not creative writing. This is not essays. This is a particular type of writing that we call legal writing. And there are certain rules that apply here that don't apply to the type of writing that you may be accustomed to, having taken anthropology or sociology or even political science courses. So while you may have been a good writer, and maybe you are a good writer, you still need to learn the skills that are applicable to this specific type of writing that's effective to a court, that's effective to get your client what your client deserves. So once you're able to break down, this ego a little bit, students are much more open to the idea that, okay, well, this is important. This is something I got to learn.
It's a skill course. And I didn't see it as a skill course. I saw it as a obstacle on my way to becoming a great attorney. Right?
Yeah.
So how does it feel being back on the campus, but this time in front of the class?
It's a little bit surreal. In some ways, a lot has changed. In other ways, it seems like everything has stayed the same. Physically, it all looks very similar. I remember the classrooms, but now I'm standing in front of them as opposed to in one of the chairs there. But it feels like everything's come full circle. It feels right. It's nice to be able to give back to the community and have my hand, hopefully, in shaping the minds of the new generations of lawyers to come. So it's also a very humbling experience, and it has given me a lot of perspective and empathy for our professors, because we expected them to be perfect, to never make a mistake, to teach everything perfectly, to know everything all the time, but really they're just humans like us, and it's given me a greater appreciation for what they did for us while we were in law school.
So do you pause anytime a student calls you a professor?
It's still, I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and still when I hear professor or excuse me, professor, or anytime that, term comes up, I'm like, wait, is there somebody behind me, or where's the professor? Who are you talking to? And I'm like, oh, actually, that's me. So then I have to live up to that title, which is tough.
So, what is one piece of advice that you now freely distribute and give out to your students that you wish someone had told you when we were in law school?
Just one. Well, I can give you one piece of advice that I specifically tell my legal writing students, and then I can give you a more general piece of advice. So, the one that I give to my legal writing students is do not wait until the last minute to do your work. Get it done at least 48 hours before the deadline. Don't look at it for at least 24 hours, and then go back and reread it. You'll find yourself catching a lot more typos and other mistakes than you would if you just immediately reread your product, 10 minutes after you finished it. It's almost like you're getting a second set of eyes when you've given your brain a break of a day or two to not think about it. So you can really improve the final product, at the very least, the professional look of it, just by giving yourself time and your brain to refocus. And I would say for the general piece of advice, and I'm pretty sure you would agree with me on this, is that you really need to network. Use all the networking services and opportunities that you can, your first year especially, but also your second and third year. Do not miss any networking opportunities. There's that old adage of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And that applies just as much in this profession as it does in any other profession. The more people you know, the better. And even if you're the top of your class and very bright and you have a great skill set for a law student, you're not going to get anywhere unless you're able to find a job. And the best way often, and the most common way that even now people find jobs, is by word of mouth. So you got to know people. So please do yourself a favor and attend as many networking events as you possibly can.
That's a great advice, and I couldn't agree with you more. Networking, networking, networking. I have plenty of memories, and I'm sure you do too, from evenings that we spent at a library. And unfortunately, I have very few memories of networking events and just grabbing coffee or lunch with fellow professors, with fellow classmates. If somebody asked me, what is one thing I wish I had done differently, I would take advantage of any networking opportunity I had.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot of regrets. I really enjoyed law school. I know a lot of people had some, pretty negative thoughts about it, but overall it was a good time, especially for somebody who enjoys reading and, thinking and in a quiet place. But I would agree with you. If I had to pick one thing that I could have done better, it's for sure networking. I mean, now racking my brain, I can think of maybe 2 events that I went to out of, who knows, dozens that were offered. And that was just a silly oversight. Nobody stressed it to me, so that's why I guess you and I are stressing it to this new generation.
Yes, we're trying to overcompensate and sort of make sure that now the people who have access to you, to me, and who are brave enough to ask, this is one piece of advice that I quite often tell: network, network, network. These days, I have plenty of networking events. I am older, bolder, but I still go to networking events.
Yeah. And, it's not just, networking is not just for finding yourself a job. It's also for when somebody comes to you with a legal problem, because of course, as soon as you're an attorney, any legal problem will come to you and everybody will expect you know everything about every part of the law. But if you do enough networking, you'll be able to point the person in the right direction and refer them to a competent lawyer for the thing that they need.
Very good. That is a great advice coming from both of us, and I hope our audience will take it to their heart and follow our recommendation.
It's one of the easier things you can do.
What do you see the biggest mistakes that law students make?
Sure. So when it comes to legal writing and research, I get the impression that a lot of students want to get it done as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, perhaps at the last minute. And what this leads to often are a lot of typos or citation issues, misspellings, and things that just make your document look unprofessional. And that has a big impact, whether you like it or not, because whoever is reading that document, whether it's a judge or opposing counsel, will immediately start to have a lower picture of you in their minds as they see these little mistakes that you should have caught. So if you have a brief that's an okay brief, but it's polished and doesn't have any citation issues or typos versus one that's maybe even a better brief, but full of these types of issues, this one might actually be more convincing to somebody who cares about professionalism. And it's one thing that should be pretty easy to fix. You just have to have attention to detail. And that's one thing that I would suggest, particularly to my legal writing students, but for anybody who's leaving law school, is to always keep attention to detail, because it affects your credibility and therefore your reputation, which are the two most important things for an attorney, I think. Now, a general piece of advice that I would give, that I think I kind of fell into this trap, especially my 1L year, is to always compare yourself to others. And this particularly came into play when we started to study for our first exams. So at the end of our first semester of our 1L year, we had our final exams. And, law students and lawyers are kind of neurotic by nature, and they start to second guess themselves, and they think they're not studying enough because that guy or that gal over there is spending 3 hours per day and you're only spending 2.5. And this actually went all the way through law school up through the bar exam. People were still comparing each other. Like, oh man, I only studied 6 hours today, but Joe over here was studying 12. He must be doing something better because it's more hours and he's probably going to pass and I'm going to fail. And then you end up getting into your head. So, don't compare yourself too much. Do what works for you. When it comes to the bar exam, the quality of study time depends, is person specific. So somebody can be as efficient and cover the same material in 6 hours that somebody else might need 12 hours. Somebody might be, fully engaged for 6 hours while somebody else is on YouTube or watching a TikTok reel or something and then studying and then going back and forth. So bottom line, do what works for you. Don't worry too much about what your neighbor is doing.
That is a great comment. And speaking of bar exam, for example, I remember both of us were shopping for new laptops because we were going to take our bar exam on a laptop, while some of our friends hand wrote the whole thing because they didn't register in time to use a laptop. The advice that I quite often give to people: you're in your own lane and you should stay in your lane and do the best you can with what you've got, where you at, and you don't have to waste time and energy looking around and comparing yourself to other people. Even something as simple as YouTube channel, people constantly compare each other. Oh, well, this guy has more views, or his channel has that many followers.
That's exactly right. And not only are you wasting time and energy, but you're probably doing a disservice to your own self-esteem that you shouldn't be doing. The more confident you are, the better. I mean, obviously you shouldn't be overconfident, but you also shouldn't, think of any less of yourself by using these artificial benchmarks of views and how many subscribers and so forth. And as you point out, that applies not only to YouTube channels, but to any aspect of life. These are artificial benchmarks, and you should focus on your lane before you look at anybody else's.
I would say, if I were to summarize all of this in one sentence, be a better version of yourself tomorrow than you are today.
Yeah, or in other words, if you want to do any comparisons, compare yourself to what you were yesterday, right? So if you want to focus on a particular aspect, I don't know, your diet or your fitness, don't compare it to somebody with a 4% body fat who's probably unhappy and never has a cheat meal or a candy bar, but you should compare yourself rather to how was your diet yesterday and have you made some improvement by today? Use yourself as a benchmark, don't use others.
Is there anything you have learned on the job that you think isn't emphasized enough in law school?
People skills. And I'll give you an anecdote from some years ago when I first started out, back before e-filing. I'm sure you remember how that went.
I remember
especially at the Daily Center, and you have to go to the clerks to get a date, right? But every clerk was different, and you had to be friendly. You had to be a good human being and kindly ask for a date. Otherwise, they would put you off, 2 months or something. So if you just, go march in there and, have no people skills and just demand, I want this, I want that, you're not going to get anywhere, because they have the say what day you're going to have your motion heard. Now that's changed a little bit with all this e-filing, but the people skills advice I think still applies. I mean, you have to know how to talk to a client who's been through a traumatic brain injury. You have to be able to talk to a client who's been sexually assaulted. You have to be sympathetic and be able to, use the right words and give the client space and, just be able to speak to people cognizant of their particular circumstances. Speak to people knowing the context that surrounds their particular case. So I would say that is a very important skill, is to be able to know how to talk to people. And that's kind of something that's difficult to really teach. Again, it's a skill. It would be difficult to teach that in law school. But even if you don't have, even if you're not the most outgoing person necessarily, it doesn't cost you anything to be kind. And always be kind, because you never know what people are going through. That applies to the legal profession, that applies to any profession. And it'll get you a lot farther if you're nice and kind and understanding, as opposed to demanding and crude.
One of the lessons I remember from law school, when we talked about jury selections, when does the jury selection begin? And I believe it was the professor who said the jury selection begins the minute you leave your house in the morning, because you never know if the person who's sitting next to you on a train that you pushed with your elbow and never say, I'm sorry, maybe that person is your potential juror. You simply don't know.
And that's a very good point. That's a very good point. A lot of the times the jury has already formed an opinion about you just by how you behave in the courtroom before you even open your mouth to deliver your opening statement. So how you carry yourself and how you behave is just as important as the words that come out of your mouth.
What's one lesson about law or life that you have learned the hard way since law school?
When it comes to the law, it's not always the party that has the better case that wins. A lot of the times you'll have a plaintiff with a very good case, but can't afford to go through all the litigation that the defense can put on, because a lot of the times defense attorney's strategy is to delay and delay and delay and keep filing, which all costs money and time, until eventually the plaintiff runs out of money or the plaintiff's lawyer runs out of money and they have to give up. So then they stop pursuing their claim. So they might have had a great claim, they just didn't have enough money to take it all the way to the end, with how many appeals and interlocutory appeals and so forth the defense has filed. And kind of similar to that, it just takes so many years sometimes for a plaintiff to get their money. And I think we can make some adjustments to the legal system to improve that process, but that would take quite an effort. But yeah, it's you think of the law as something that furthers justice, right? In a romantic way. But a lot of the times it just comes down to the dollar sign, and that's kind of the sad part that I've learned throughout the years.
So the justice is not swift.
It's not swift or cheap.
It's a great point, because in my first consultations with personal injury clients, I always like to address the elephant in the room. How much is my case worth? Which is pretty much impossible to estimate at the beginning. And the next question I anticipate coming from the potential client is, when will my case resolve? When will it settle? Or when will it go to trial? It will take a long time, most likely a few years, before you see any resolution. Whether in court or even outside of court, it may take a lot of time for justice to happen.
And I imagine throughout that time, you're also putting the plaintiff who's lost an arm or had brain damage or this or that through depositions, through all kinds of things that further make them relive that trauma of what caused the injury. So not only is it a waiting game, but it's also a lot of times, I think, emotionally difficult for the plaintiff.
If you could go back, what would you do differently as a 1L, as a first-year law student?
Well, we touched on this a little bit earlier, and I think both of us should have networked more and used the opportunities that we had. And like I said before, I did enjoy law school and 1L year too, but I would say to anybody who's thinking about going to law school or is currently maybe a 1L, enjoy it. It can be a fun and mentally rewarding endeavor the first year. You're in a room with smart people. You're talking about things that require logical thinking, some thinking outside the box. So enjoy the intellectual aspect of it as well.
I very much agree. Law school was great. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Looking back at it, we had so much fun. Me, you, and few of other classmates with whom we studied, we actually laughed very, very hard and very often throughout law school.
It's true, we did. But now I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
How do you know whether you should go to law school? Because a lot of the time I think people finish their undergrad studies and they wonder, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with my degree in basket weaving, so maybe I should go to law school. What would you say to that person or anybody who's thinking about going to law school without really knowing what we know now, having actually gone through it?
I like to approach those types of decisions working back. So you have to understand what the law school will give you, right? You don't go to law school just for the sake of going to law school. The idea is that you will be a lawyer, some sort of lawyer, practicing some sort of law. So I would trace it back. Why do you even want to go to law school? And I'm sure you're familiar with the cliche saying, I'm great at arguing, right? I'm great at arguing. Or my mom or my dad always said, I argue a lot, I should be a lawyer. Well, that's not always the case. There's plenty of other things you can do with 3 years of your life, most likely 4, because then you still have to graduate and study for the bar and wait for the results. So why are you going to law school? Is there nothing else you can do with 4 years of your time and hundreds of thousands of dollars in tuition money, presumably?
You're right. And it's definitely not a decision to be taken lightly for all these reasons. And not only tuition, but also the cost of living. I mean, I don't recommend that anybody work during law school. I think it's something that you should basically treat as a full-time job.
It is a full-time job, and you have to devote yourself absolutely to your study and to networking, as we said, right?
Network.
We all shop on Amazon, and we all evaluate products based on the cost and benefit analysis. So I recommend that you apply the same cost and benefit analysis to your law school decision.
Yeah, think about your return on investment. And of course, there's always a degree of uncertainty. You can't know for sure if it's going to make you happy or not. But the more research you do up front and the more you consider all the costs and benefits, then the better off you are, I think.
I think the best advice to somebody who's considering law school is like with everything else in life. You have to know what you're getting yourself into. But there's plenty of attorneys like you and myself who are willing to share, right? We're sharing our stories right now. Call, email, or get in touch with an attorney you like and trust and have a frank conversation. And I'm sure it'll be easier for you to make that decision with somebody who has already done it than trying to make it on your own.
Indeed. And I think most attorneys are more than happy to share their feedback.
Can you think of a moment when your classroom law student experience was completely different from the real world scenario?
Yeah, I can. And in particular, with respect to evidence. Now, evidence is a course that was required for us, I'm pretty sure, and it should be required. I mean, we should all know how the federal rules of evidence work and how our state's rules work. Usually there's a lot of overlap between the federal rules and most of the rules of the states. But, it was one of the toughest classes we had because there were a lot of exceptions to exceptions to exceptions, a typical law class, and especially when it came to hearsay, among other things. And what I noticed in the courtroom, during hearings and trials, the judge just makes immediate decisions on whether something is admissible or not, where in class we would spend 20, 30 minutes going through all the intricacies and all the rules to ensure how this double hearsay does or does not have an exception. But then in court, somebody might not even object to it. And if they do, the judge makes an immediate call on it. And then if you challenge that, it's usually reviewed for, I think, abuse of discretion. It's a pretty deferential standard. So you go to law school thinking these are really clear-cut like rules that you have to follow. But then when you get to the courtroom, it matters if somebody actually objected in the first place. And secondly, the judge may or may not have made the right call, but then you just keep going anyway. It seems a lot more, relaxed than it did in law school.
You're right. And I can recall one instance when an attorney tried to make the point again to make sure the judge understands the request. And ultimately, the judge responded with something along the lines of, "Not in my courtroom." What's your favorite legal movie or TV show and why?
Well, there are a ton out there, that's for sure. Some are more realistic than others. I know a lot of people love Legally Blonde. That's, of course, everybody's at least top three. But I would say for myself, I am partial to Better Call Saul. If you recall, that was the spinoff from Breaking Bad, the show in which the chemistry teacher decided to start cooking meth to support his family because he couldn't, he was dying of cancer. And then he had an attorney eventually to help with laundering his money. And then that attorney got his own show called Better Call Saul. And he's a criminal defense attorney, but with emphasis on criminal, if you know what I mean. And, I like that show for a lot of reasons. It's very well made. And it's actually very realistic and accurate when it comes to the legal profession. But it also portrays the attorney as somebody who's just a human being trying to make it in the world. And in particular, how difficult it can be to start your own practice, right? Which I'm sure you have a lot of experience with. At the beginning of Better Call Saul, you see that he's got this office/cot in the back of this nail salon where
I remember that.
he has access sometimes, and it's just like the worst little office. And then he's got that car where one of the doors is a different color and it starts half the time and half the time it doesn't. And you could just totally see that it's his passion for his work that's driving him and getting him to do this work. And he starts off wanting to do well and good, and then he just kind of gets corrupted by the whole process. But I like the show because it's so well made, and it really shows you what goes into especially starting your own practice and how difficult it can be, and how you can get involved with some pretty shady characters if you're not careful.
That's a great advice. And I think this plays to what we just discussed about the advice for people who are considering law school. You don't want to graduate with a ton of debt and be pushed into jobs or opportunities you should have nothing to do with in the first place.
Right.
If you couldn't be a lawyer or a professor, what would you be doing today?
What would I be? What would you be? A banker?
A YouTuber. In law school, I didn't have a Facebook because I was concerned about privacy. Yeah. And now I am publishing stuff every other day.
The fact that I don't have an immediate answer to this is probably testament to having made the right decision. I mean, if I can't imagine being something else, then, being involved with the legal field, I don't know what I would do. It was never like I had a plan B. It was just this plan. This was plan A, and that's it. And there's that saying, you should never have a plan B because all it does is detract from plan A. I think that applies to me in this case. So sorry I don't have an alternative career to suggest for myself. That's kind of scary in a way, but I also, as I said, it's another reason or another way that it shows that I've made the right decision.
I will second you. It shows that we made a good and proper choice, but it was the right choice for us, for our circumstances, which may not be the best choice for our audience.
And it's completely fine if that's not the right choice for you. I mean, don't get pushed into it or bullied into it by, a family member or a friend who thinks it's the best for you. You got to decide if it's the best thing for you, and it's completely fine to do anything else. The last thing you want to do is end up in a profession that you hate every day. I mean, it's at least a third of your life, 8 hours. And with the legal field, it's probably more than that. So you want to make sure that you're happy for that big chunk of your time.
It's interesting that you made this point because we have been talking for a while and not even once did we mention money or financial reward, which quite often I remember from when we were law school, people would think that you went to law school because you were motivated by money or at least the potential of earning good money. So it's interesting that that topic didn't even once appear in our discussion today as we're reflecting on our career choices.
That's a very good point. And what else didn't really come up is time, the amount of time that we put into work. We didn't talk about how much time you put in or how much time I put in teaching or, my main job as a clerk. And in fact, right now it's Saturday afternoon and we're choosing to talk about the law in our free time. We spent several hours on this and we haven't even, until now, I haven't even thought about it as a, work related task. It's something that clearly we both enjoy doing. So, I guess you've made the right decision if you can talk about all these aspects of your career you're happy about without referencing all these horrible hours you got to put in and, not making as much as you would have wanted.
And especially coming out of the Thanksgiving and Christmas and holiday season, I'm sure many of us met with family members, friends, and listened to plenty of complaints about their job, their bosses, and how they have to go back to work after New Year's, right?
Yeah.
I was actually looking forward.
I was too.
I was looking forward to finally working a full week at the office.
Yeah, there's something stabilizing about it and rewarding about it. And I don't know. I feel the same way.
Before we go, what's the one final piece of advice that you would leave our audience with?
I feel like we've been offering a lot of advice.
Free advice.
A lot of free legal advice. Well, now that we touched on the issue of money and earnings and hours worked and so forth, one thing that I would emphasize to anybody who's now an undergrad considering going to law school is to, do your very best and take time to study for the LSAT. Because the better you do on the LSAT and the better your GPA is, the better scholarships you can get, and apply for as many of those as you can. To every school that you apply to, ask their admissions office, what scholarships do you offer? How do I apply for them? A lot of the times they will just offer them to you on their own, but you can also ask and apply for as many as possible because you will thank yourself later when you have, a few tens of thousands to give back or maybe nothing as opposed to 250 grand. So make use of all the scholarship money that's available to you.
That is a great advice. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing with me, with the audience. And I look forward to having you on the show again, hopefully in the near future.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me here. And I'm always available for contact. I think Greg will post that information. So if anybody needs has any burning questions or thinks I can be of any assistance, please feel free to reach out.
If you want to learn more about Dario and his work, I have included his contact information in the video description below, so make sure to check that out. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell icon so you don't miss future episodes. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.